So I'm gonna give the class of Friday again in this YouTube recording. So those of you who were in our last class on the 27th, you already saw this material, but I am discussing it again because that recording did not go through. So as mentioned, this class is a continuation of talking about the models of the spread of English around the world. So we're talking about the model of the two dispersals, also known as the two diasporas, diaspora. So we said that characteristic of the first dispersal was the speaking of English as a native language or a mother tongue. So countries that were settled in the first dispersal or in the first diaspora of British and Irish and Scottish settlers included United States or America, right? Included Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The second dispersal, when we refer to this diaspora, we are referring to the second settlements that took place much later in the 18th and 19th centuries and were centered more around Africa and Asian countries. Now, Africa and Asian countries, a lot of the contexts that we're going to talk about now ended up adopting English as a second language for official government purposes. So the history of English in these countries is also quite different according to the region that we're talking about. For instance, when we're going to talk about Africa, the continent, with such a large territory, right? We can talk about it in terms of different regions: north, west, east, central, south. But specifically for the second dispersal, we're going to talk about West and East Africa and the influence of English in these contexts. So West Africa, the settlements of the British people there and the spread of English is heavily linked to the slave trade that took place in the West Atlantic slave trade, right? Which characterized a lot of the settlements also in the Caribbean. So in West Africa, British settlers come in and they also enslave people and take people from West Africa to the Caribbean in exchange for sugar and rum. Okay, so since it's linked to slave trade, the English that occurs in this context can be said to be hybrid because in these contexts, the languages that were spoken were others. And because the people in these communities spoke other languages and the British people spoke English, in order for them to communicate with one another or understand one another, they built a bridge language that we're going to call Pidgin, right? And once the Pidgin stabilized and was passed down to younger generations and children, it became a Creole once it was stabilized. So West African countries involved in the second dispersal include Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. From late 15th century onwards, British traders traveled to various places in West Africa. There was no major, however, British settlement in these areas. So they didn't stay there for much long. They did, but their influence wasn't as felt as in other areas, right? So English in these contexts, West Africa, was installed as a lingua franca among the indigenous population. So it was installed as a bridge language. There were hundreds of local languages and British traders. So as mentioned, because there were two different cultures or there were many different cultures coming into contact, African cultures and British cultures. This led to the development of what are hybrid languages like Pidgins and Creoles. So eventually English gained official status for West African countries, and English-based Pidgins and Creoles were also developed from contact with English-speaking populations. So some examples of these hybrid languages that had English include Creole in Sierra Leone and Cameroon Pidgin English in Cameroon, which are now spoken by many even as a second language. So usually when a Pidgin achieves second language status or it's passed down, it can be called a Creole. So here I've included a video that demonstrates the differences between Nigerian and Cameroonian Pidgin, countries that are both in West Africa, both developed a hybrid way of communicating Pidgin, right? But they are not so similar sounding. If you play the clip, there's certain differences in consonant sounds, and but what is common between these two languages is how they both have a foundation or a base in English. So ambos tienen algo de inglés. So when you play this clip that will be made available for you, if aparte, apart from this PowerPoint, you'll realize that if you know the translation to the Pidgin, you'll think to yourself, yeah, it makes sense. Actually, this sounds a lot like English. Some of the examples mentioned in this video include the phrase, "What is this?" In the second dispersal, we can also talk about East Africa. So East African countries include Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. These countries were extensively settled by British colonists from 1850s onwards. So again, we're talking about 18th and 19th centuries for the second dispersal. So after West Africa, right, if you look at the timeline, 1819, at the same time we have East Africa. So one of the famous explorers of East Africa is known as David Livingstone. So he, alongside others, led to the creation of 6 countries that became protectorates or colonies between 19th and early 20th centuries in East Africa. So protectorates or colonia de Britain. So there's a video that you can also watch on your own on David Livingstone, the explorer of East Africa. In this settlement, English played an important role in government and other institutions. What are institutions? Well, such as education and law. In the 1960s, however, all 6 countries that we can talk about that had a major English influence achieved independence. However, since this is modern history and this wasn't that long ago, English is still an official language in most of these countries: Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and many people from East Africa still speak it or also speak it as a second language, despite the fact that they achieved independence in modern history. Swahili is most likely to be used, however, over English, specifically in the context of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. All right. And if you look, English, here it says English is still an official language in Uganda, but Swahili is most likely to be seen in Uganda. Tanzania is not in this list, but in our next slide, it says Swahili is mostly spoken there. So English appears to, well, it hasn't been mentioned as having an official language. neither is Kenya. So we can verify this now and look up official languages of Kenya. It says English has an official status in Kenya at the moment. So unlike what this book says, English still has an official status. However, so does Swahili. And the main language, according to statistics in Kenya, is Swahili. So it's always important to double check the statistics from the book and the official status of a language, because that can change. So the takeaway point is that despite the settlements of East Africa and the gained independence of the 1960s, English is still used and still has official status and has many speakers of it as a second language. Now we're going to talk about South Asia. South Asia, podemos hablar, we can talk about India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So during the half of the 18th century, so 18th century on 1850s onwards, English is formally introduced. Formally means in school. Whenever we say formal, we mean academically and in educational context. But English was there before. So in early 1600s, when the East India Company established settlements in Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, English was there. And what was the East India Company? It was a joint stock company founded in the 1600s. It was used to form trade in the Indian Ocean, right? And initially with East Indies, so Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, and later with China. So it was a trade company. So in 1835, however, English is proposed as a language of instruction. So we decide that there should be a policy that instructs English in schools. So even though it had a presence in the early 1600s, in the 18th century, we see the policies being made that suggest that English should be used. So English is still the language of instruction in these contexts, specifically India today. Today, English is the official language of India. English is an associate official language, asociado, next to Hindi. So both of them are official languages of India. And there's a distinct dialect of English in India that people talk about that we can call Indian English. This means that the English that is found in India is not necessarily the same as the English that we see in the UK, even though there are influences of UK British English. But probably because there's another language that's also widely used, like Hindi and there's also a lot of other languages. There's 22 official languages in India. Due to the fact that it's a different social context and there's a lot of other linguistic groups, well, you know, we have different cultural contexts, so there's a different dialect there, Indian English. So now we're going to talk about Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the South Pacific. So aquí estamos en contexto, en el mapa sale Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the South Pacific por ahí. Well, so a region of it specifically. So in the late 18th century, Then we talk about expeditions by James Cook, which is the man in the image. So explorations of this kind of East Asia and Southeast Asia included countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Philippines, and Papua New Guinea for a short while. Papua New Guinea, una islita that's highlighted here, that is very linguistically heterogeneous. It has hundreds of languages. It's linguistically diverse, and it's often used for many studies of indigenous languages and indigenous language documentation. So in Papua New Guinea, we also witness a Creole language. What is a Creole language? A Creole language is a mixed hybrid language that has been stabilized and passed down through generations. So we do see a Creole language in Papua New Guinea that is based on English. So it takes a lot from English, and it's called Tok Pisin. So James Cook, right, he also settled in the Philippines, La Filipina. And Philippines, we probably know for the Philippines out of our own personal history, as Puerto Ricans, we know that in 1898, Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris by the Spanish, ¿verdad? Fue cedido. Well, in this same treaty, we have the shared influence of the Philippines also being ceded to the United States, however, alongside Guam. However, the Philippines accomplished their independence in 1946. Even though they are independent, they still have a strong American English influence. The national language of the Philippines is Filipino, which is a standardized version of Tagalog. And this language, Filipino, is official alongside English. So even though they gained independence, much like East African countries that we mentioned and other countries, it still has an official status. So in the Philippines, they have many mixed Creole languages that have, instead of English, that have Spanish or are influenced by Spanish. Chabacán is one of them. I'm sure that they're also influenced by English, given the role of English on the islands as one of the official languages. So now we're going to talk about Singapore. Maybe some of you have heard of Singapore as this very modern country, but Singapore has gone a long way at present economically, but it is a post-colony. It has increased its use of English in recent years, possibly to be able to compete with the global economy and be as successful as they've been able to be, because English has such a prominent role in Singapore. We can also talk about a variety of English in Singapore, or a dialect of English called Singaporean English. So there have been studies that have tried or attempted to describe this type of English or this style of English as unique to the Singaporean people. So different from Indian English, different from English in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and other English-speaking contexts. So this is a quote from our book on Singaporean English. So it appears that a distinct brand of Singaporean English is emerging, common to all ethnic living groups in the country, and quite unlike the varieties of English found in most other parts of the world, though it is true that many of its features are shared with the English spoken in Malaysia. It seems likely that the main difference between the English of the various ethnic groups in Singapore lies in intonation. Intonation es la melodía, it's the melody of language. It's the rising and falling of a sentence. So They claim that Singaporean English has its own unique intonation patterns, though the precise details of the intonation of different groups have yet to be established. It is quite possible to sound Singaporean, but still be easily understood in the rest of the world. And it seems that a mature variety of educated Singaporean English is indeed emerging. So this is a citation from David Detterding, Singaporean English in Edinburgh University Press, 2007. So in Malaysia, the use of English has declined. So this is in stark contrast to the other context that we've been talking about that mentioned that English still has an important role in other countries. But in Malaysia, it appears that the use has declined. The main reason for this being that there is a local language called Malaysia Bahasa, and it seems to have garnered a lot of support, and it has an official language status. So it's the official national language. Following the independence of Malaysia in 1957, they also adopted Malaysian Bahasa as the main language of instruction in schools. So this is probably, you know, a movement of resistance, a movement of cultural, of maintaining and fighting for one's cultural heritage. So el momento que se convierte en independiente, ahí cambian el idioma nacional al suyo local. Versus when they were a post-colony, English had a more prominent role and status and had and was more widely spoken. But now Malaysia Bahasa is more widely spoken. However, even though Malaysian Bahasa is more widely spoken, English is still obligatory. So Malaysia still ranks high in the number of English speakers that say that they speak it advanced or proficiently, but English is primarily viewed as a tool to facilitate international communication rather than necessarily something of the country. In other countries that are not mentioned in the two diasporas, the two dispersals, English has also been adopted primarily as an outcome of globalization, technology, international economy, advances in travel and movement, and you have people from all over the world moving around. So other Asian countries that don't necessarily have a historical or political tie to the United States or Britain or any Anglophone country have adopted English and have installed schools to teach English to their populations. So China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, English is widely used in these contexts. And in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, they have considered and also spoke about the possibility of adopting English as an official second language, even though they don't share ties, socio-political ties or any histories, right? So since 1945, most of the remaining colonies have become independent states. But we know it's not the case for us. With English, however, being retained in all of these contexts. So in the majority of these contexts, English has been retained to fulfill certain roles, particular roles. Even though they're independent, English is still there. English is used, number one, to provide various internal functions. So in internal functions, government functions, institutional functions, English is used. And second, to serve as a neutral lingua franca. And this is especially the case in contexts such as East Africa and West Africa, when we have a lot of linguistically diverse populations that don't have a common language, then they may resort to English to be able to communicate with one another and understand each other. So the Englishes that resulted from the two dispersals have a lot in common. Firstly, we can talk about a shared history. Secondly, we talk about a sociocultural tie or affinity to either British or North American culture in these contexts. So hay como que una influencia aún de la cultura británica y estadounidense en estos contextos de poscolonia. Por ejemplo, americana, pues en los Philippines que dijimos que inglés aún se utiliza. English from the two dispersals also have differences. So the Englishes in these two contexts have differences. Perhaps the first one that comes to mind to all of us is accent pronunciación. And it's the most obvious one and the one that's likely to change a lot. Second, we can talk about vocabulary, vocabulario. And here's where we can think about some of the examples that we see on internet memes or YouTube videos or TikTok videos dedicated to talking about the differences, for instance, between North American and British English. But then we saw the video of the differences between the pidgin languages. And then, you know, we can talk about differences in all of the Englishes and vocabulary. And how the indigenous populations and other cultures that are in contact with English in those places influence what vocabulary is going to be adopted. We can also talk about differences in grammar, even though grammar tends to be more stable, estable, and as well as other strategies of discourse, of discurso, such as the organization of a sentence or storytelling. More broader categories of speech are included in discourse. So here's a summary of the diasporas that we discussed. In the first position, we discussed USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also South Africa, not included there. But in the second dispersal, we have South Africa, South Asia, colonial Africa, which is West and East, Southeast Asia, and South Pacific. Sorry, South Africa is part of the second diaspora. So this is the homework that you guys have due for tomorrow at 11:59 p.m., where you talk about your linguistic background. So you submit your answers to this to our eCourses website. Thank you so much for watching.